Namaste and a hearty welcome to Soft Talk. In this episode of the program, I'll be talking about multiple crises that are in the air in Nepal. So let me start. First of all, let me talk about this crisis resulting from the arrival of what I call uninvited guests. You must have guessed what I mean by those uninvited guests. I'm talking about the arrival of the swarms of locusts. Earlier, in early June, there were reports of those locusts ravaging crops in India, Pakistan, and several other parts of the world. But we seem to be ill at ease. Our officialdom, our government, our bureaucrats seem to be ill at ease despite warnings from several quarters, including the media. Our officials seem to be thinking uh, if those reports appearing in national media are any guide, they seem to be thinking that they have these locusts have a very short life cycle. The rains have arrived, and the afflicted countries have taken several control measures to rein in on them, so will not be that much affected. So the locusts won't come to Nepal. They won't fly into Nepal as some disaster. That was their reading. But once again, their reading proved incorrect. Once again, we were ill prepared in the face of a looming crisis. So now they have arrived. What I feel in the worst case scenario is that these locusts will ravage crops. That means our food insecurity situation will become more serious. This food insecurity has been brewing all along with this coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown imposed, this lockdown that the government has imposed to control the pandemic. So maybe we can just learn now that these low costs have arrived. Maybe we can learn some lessons from countries that have weathered the crisis. For example, I read reports that Pakistan took this ingenious measure with some success to control the pests. What they did is they just used those locusts to make high quality, high value, high value chicken feed. The chicken feed industries of that country just mobilized farmers to catch those locusts. You should note that these locusts don't fly at night. They just take rest on the tree branches. So what the industries did was to just mobilize the farmers to catch those locusts at night, and they would just buy those catches from the farmers and turn those high protein insects, pests, into chicken feed. That was an effective measure. The Pakistanis were learning lessons from Sudan, a civil war ravaged country dealing with a serious food shortage, dealing with a food crisis. So that lessons they learned, but in course of time they ran out of funds. The Pakistanis ran out of funds as per media reports, and they had to discontinue that program. So maybe we can learn lessons, though ill prepared, we can still learn lessons from Pakistan and just repeat that success story. That is what I think is one of the best options when it comes to dealing with this low cost menace. Other than that, what I have read is that this low cost menace afflicted this country 6 decades ago. At that time, also, we were ill prepared like we are today. The government was ill prepared. This menace led to a serious food crisis. Now, also, no different seems to be the case, especially in view of the fact that we are already dealing with a pandemic, coronavirus 19 pandemic, and a draconian lockdown imposed to control it. This pandemic has already led to food insecurity situation, and this low cost menace will just aggravate that crisis. In the worst case scenario, it will definitely deepen the crisis that we are in. The best case scenario, I don't see, because the government does not seem to be well prepared when it comes to dealing with this crisis, and I don't see the gods coming to our help. If that happens, all the better. In times of multiple crises, I see, I watch, I witness, I observe this government not being able to meet expectations of the people. On the contrary, remarks coming from the head of the government are giving people like one more opportunity to laugh, forgetting this crisis. We have seen this tendency of the head of the government entering into territories, into fields that definitely are not his own. Of late, he has become a kind of laughing stock for making remarks that this turmeric can be a cure for coronavirus. Social media is like full of pictures of people drowning in turmeric, people making jokes about the prime minister. This gives me like this gives me a feeling as if this government is becoming like a disaster of sorts in these troubled times. It would have been better if the head of the government had just confined himself to delivering good governance, mobilizing ministers to the hilt to deliver good governance, to control corruption, to ensure the rule of law. That would have been a great relief. That would have provided a great relief to people grappling with multiple crises. But that is not happening. Once in a while, the Prime Minister just makes remarks. Of course, he is a learned man. He has a huge contribution when it comes to establishing this Republican order, this federal Republican order, this democratic setup. People know that and people respect him for that. That's why he is like chairing the high position repeatedly. He has the like he has got the opportunity to solve the solve the country more than one time as the prime minister. That is one of the greatest honors that the current prime minister has received from the people. So his focus should be on delivering good governance, uh, controlling corruption, streamlining his government, and making the ministers work. Maybe he can do a huge service to the country by cutting down on expenses that this government is incurring. This government is like spending a huge fortune in the upkeep of political leaders. Uh, he can just or his finance minister can just cut down on that budget to provide relief to the people. That will give a huge respite to the people, to this crisis inflicted, this crisis inflicted, to this multiple crisis inflicted country. But that is not happening. On the contrary, his remarks uh, are like being made fun of. He is being made fun of, which is not good. uh, I think which is this will not do good for the longevity of the system. You know, we have this political changes, these political changes happening in course of a decade or so. This instability gripping the country. So his remarks is like veering off from the field that he is to solve, that he is supposed to solve, will just somehow lead to just mass resentment, which may fuel another bout of political instability, uh, because this inaction, this lack of seriousness in times of deepening crisis will just weaken the system and give rise and only embolden those powers that are against this government, that are against this system. So, the Prime Minister, I humbly ask the Prime Minister and his ministers to just be sensitive while making remarks. They would rather do well to just give their everything to their respective fields instead of venturing into fields that are not their own. Of course, the nothing is beyond politics, but then a politician talking about offering remedy, suggesting cures for a pandemic, that does not sound that good, that does not sound that impressive. You'd rather leave that thing, just leave that dealing with the pandemic thing to subject experts. rather hire them, just put them in the right places and use their services to just reduce the impact of this raging pandemic at a time when cases are surging in Nepal. They have already crossed, I think, uh, 12,000 at a time when India is witnessing a rapid rise in cases, and at a time when China is also, especially Beijing, is witnessing a new surge in cases. Amid this public outrage against this lockdown enforced to control the pandemic, the government has eased the lockdown. This means like more and more people will just travel to nooks and crannies of this country during the festive season. With that movement, the pandemic will make inroads into several parts of the country that have so far remained uninfected. So, this will add to the challenge that we are facing in controlling this pandemic. This lockdown, in fact, the government should not have taken as the panacea for the pandemic. Rather, it should have taken that lockdown as a time buying measure to widen screening, to set up more hospitals, to set up, rather say, more hospital beds, medical facilities, improve conditions at the quarantine camps and isolation rooms, but it did not seem to have done so. So, what will happen is people will have to pay the price. They will have to deal with the disease, they will have to deal with the raging pandemic, they will have to deal with this joblessness, serious food insecurity situation. The people at the receiving end will have to deal with all of them, with the government nowhere to be seen. That will be a horrible scenario. Other than that, this government also seems to be dealing with what I call an MCC crisis. As you already know, the United States government is offering Nepal some assistance through its Millennium Challenge Corporation program. There have been a lot of discussions on whether to accept this assistance or not. The policymakers have found a topic for discussion. The TV hosts have found a hot topic, a very hot button issue for discussion. The politicians have found a unique opportunity to exercise their intelligence. The analysts also have a field day. They seem to be fully engaged in TV shows, in radio interviews, in newspapers, writings about, speaking about this assistance that the United States is offering. But there is this thing, there is a saying in English that there is no such thing called free lunch. The same applies to foreign aid, regardless of whether it's coming from India, China, the United States, Europe, maybe Africa. This applies to all kinds of foreign aid. The donors always have their vested interests in giving foreign aid to mostly developed countries. So, this is also, I think, no exception. They always have their interests, vested interests. They always have this geo strategic component to such aid. So it will be naive to think that they are coming, they are just giving us money out of generosity. I'm saying this theory, this principle applies not only to one country, it applies to the US, it applies to China, it applies to India or any other country, any other development partner. So it will always be good for developing countries to not accept foreign aid if they can mobilize their resources to achieve development uh, objectives, to meet their demands, to meet their development demands, to meet the aspirations of the people. It will always be good to just not beg, I would say, because there is this saying, another saying that says the beggars cannot be choosers, and this applies to foreign aid. So we would be always be in a better position if we manage to mobilize our resources to meet our development expectations rather than accepting any foreign aid. We can, of course, negotiate, seek to negotiate the terms of the trade, but the donors may not budge. In that case, we may have no option but to just meekly accept the terms and conditions of the aid. There's this debate going on uh, among experts, among analysts, among policymakers on whether this aid, this MCC aid, this American aid is part of the Indo Pacific strategy. To me, it doesn't matter whether it's part of the Indo Pacific strategy or not. What matters is foreign aid has strings attached. They always, foreign aid always puts the priority of the donors at the expense of national interests of the receiving country. So that is the most important thing to consider. This debate, this ongoing discussion seems to me a kind of exercise in futility. So we should just think long and hard. We should strive to mobilize our own resources. That will not be easy, but we should always just try to use our own resources to meet our expectations rather than accepting foreign aid from any country, whether it's in the name of BRI, whether it's, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's in the form of MCC, whether it's in the form of some idols from uh, with assistance from India, that will almost always benefit India at the expense of Nepal. Whether it's any water sharing arrangement with India, that has almost always benefited India at the expense of Nepal, and that will always continue to do so because of our weak institutional capacity, that because of our weak bargaining power. So we should be very careful when it comes to accepting foreign aid. That is my reading, and I think like the policymakers of this country wake up to this bitter reality that nothing comes for free. There is no such thing called free lunch. They should realize this and act accordingly. That is my humble suggestion to this government, to the policymakers, to the great debaters, to the great TV hosts. That is all I have to say. Uh, with this, I wrap up this edition of Soft Talk. Please comment on my presentation, subscribe my channel, and you have the liberty to like this presentation, give your suggestions, insightful suggestions, uh, so that I can improve on my performance, improve on my presentation, and add value to this program. Thank you for watching. Keep watching this channel for updates. Thank you.